All right. So, something that I encounter on a regular basis um, that can lend to people questioning either their belief in God or what I see even more often than that is that if a person's on a kind of trajectory of questioning their belief in God, they will begin to question or ask the question, if God exists, why doesn't He answer my prayers? Um, they'll pray something like, why don't you just reveal yourself to me? Or they'll set conditions around that of like, why don't you just appear to me in my bedroom? Or send an angel to me? Or something of that nature. Why don't you do this for me? Do that for me? Usually fairly extraordinary circumstances, but um, the, the crux of it is do something tangible in order to prove that you exist. And so I think the crux for answering that question, why didn't God answer my prayer for, let's say, healing for my grandmother from cancer? Well, I think the sum of it is that there's an imbalance in the nature. If you're going to assume God has the power, the authority to intervene in a circumstance you would ask Him to intervene on, it would follow necessarily that He also has the power and authority to deny your request. See, kind of an underlying premise of the question thereafter of why didn't He answer is the assumption that God is somehow beholden to our request, that if I ask, He has to do something. And it's kind of tied to how in Matthew 6, Jesus is teaching about prayer, and He says, don't be like the Gentiles who, heaping up their many words, think that they will get what they want. Essentially, that a lot of kind of Greek or pagan beliefs believed that if you recite a specific syllable, like the Eastern Om, or if you repeat a specific prayer or specific incantation a limited number of times, let's say 1,000 times in a day, or 100,000 times before next worship, or something along that line, that whatever your patron deity would be beholden to obey your request. That if you recite the incantation forwards or backwards or something along that line, unfortunately, Catholicism has sort of perpetuated this in the idea of Hail Marys to absolve sin, or Our Fathers, or so forth. That if you recite something, that God has to follow through with whatever it is you want Him to do. However, anyone with small children will acknowledge that sometimes children ask for things that they're not ready for. Sometimes they ask for things they just can't have. And if they're especially persistent, for instance, the temper tantrum in the grocery store to get a toy or candy, a good parent will endure the storm of the temper tantrum and still withhold the request because they know it's better for the child for it to be withheld, because sugar is not good for them, soda is not good for them, that you're not going to reward their negative behavior, and like there's a lot of principles at play there. But simply, if God has the power, God has the authority, then He has the authority also not to. Otherwise, He's not worth petitioning. If He doesn't have the authority to say no, then He doesn't have the authority to say yes either. But when we're in an emotional circumstance like that, when we're provoked. Like, for instance, I'm in a conversation with someone where they're like, but my daughter prayed to God to have their nightmares taken away. Why would God ignore that? Well, what is God's priorities? See, discomfort and pain are not opposed to the plan or the will of God. Oftentimes, they're actually the mechanisms of the will of God, because when we're comfortable and safe, we tend to attribute those features of our lives to ourselves. It's because I go to work every day. It's because I'm a disciplined worker. It's because I'm a skilled artist. It's because because I've made good investment decisions. None of it tailing back to, no, everything comes from the hand of God, including the good, and that He is the one deserving of the credit for the good things in my life, and that everything in my life that's bad is usually actually the product of my own decision making. I made a poor decision in the relationship to begin the relationship with this man or this woman, and that is what's created the pain, sorrow, heartbreak, disappointment that I feel now. I shouldn't have done that. But now God has allowed that to hopefully teach me the lesson that making a relationship decision based on sex is unwise, and I will not make that decision in the future. Or, I mean, there's infinite circumstances that we can use to do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. But the point is, most of the time this question is an emotional one, it's not a rational one. And if you dig down in through the emotional appeals to the reasoning behind it, it breaks down rather quickly. Like, it just dissolves into its base parts. So I would encourage you, if you believe that any of those things, that if I'm emotionally dedicated to a cause, that God is required to do it for me, because I asked Him to begin considering, what is it that you're actually worshiping? Because if God is worthy of worship, He's worthy of the benefit of the doubt, essentially, to us, that maybe He has a plan for you that doesn't necessarily include you being 100% happy and comfortable all the time. So there's a lot there, but simply, God is bigger than your nightmares, but He also can use your nightmares to draw Him towards yourself, to Himself, to, like, He is bigger than your emotions, but He also can use your emotions. But also those things are just as easily deceptive, and they can, if you allow them to, not resting in truth, not reaffirming the truth of what you know about God rather than how you feel about Him in a moment, that they're just not a reasonable basis for belief. So, I don't know. I hope this was helpful. And if you got questions, leave them. I'd love to answer.